So Twitter, continuing down their road of censorship that they've been following, is now not only censoring opinion that the company disagrees with, but actual facts. It's been a common thread for a while now that people have recognized that Twitter seems to censor folks on the right and, conservative speakers and people who are kind of outside of the political ideology of Silicon Valley elites. However, something new that started to happen in the last year or so, I'd say, is that Twitter has been seen censoring accounts that are not necessarily right-wing or political in any sense, or in some cases are even left-wing, but simply accounts that disagree with certain governments around the world that may or may not have a good deal of influence over Twitter. We just saw this in the last couple of weeks with the Hong Kong protests going on. Twitter suspended for some time Chinese dissidents who were speaking out in favor of the Hong Kong protesters and sort of making their case online, of course, in either Cantonese or Mandarin. I'm not exactly sure which, but it wasn't in English. Essentially, this was a non-English source that was countering the Chinese government narrative. And of course, they also did this with respect to Tiananmen Square. Accounts that are known to oppose the Chinese government were suspended temporarily around the time of the Tiananmen Square anniversary, and then were unsuspended after that date passed, essentially muzzling them for the time in which they could have made the most difference in telling their fellow Chinese about all the horrors that their government committed. And so the obvious implication here is that the Chinese government essentially told Twitter, hey, we realize that, we don't even let you operate in our country. We would still like you to censor people who don't like us and who are against our horrible, tyrannical, genocidal regime. And for some reason, Jack, being the Portland hippie that he is, decided to oblige the Chinese for some reason. And it's still not clear why Twitter would work with foreign governments or any government to try and muzzle dissenters. But this week we find that trend has gotten even worse because Twitter has now started censoring and suspending open source intelligence accounts, which are not really opinion-based accounts. Those are just accounts that tweet out news. Now, for those of you who are unaware, open source intelligence, or OSINT, is essentially raw information that is gathered via social media. So like people posting pictures on Twitter or Facebook of ongoing news events, but things that have not necessarily been aggregated by mainstream outlets like CNN or the BBC and then been put into stories. This is the raw data itself, and that is open source intelligence. And so these OSINT accounts on Twitter, they scour the internet for this intelligence, and then they tweet it out. Now, the reason why I put these folks in the same class as the dissidents in China is that a lot of these OSINT accounts are putting out information that counters the narrative propagated by certain governments when it comes to conflicts. For example, the Syrian government may put out a statement saying, oh, the Israelis bombarded us with missiles, but we shot them all down. But an OSINT account on Twitter may find pictures of buildings that are freshly been blown to bits in Damascus, and then they will put out those pictures to counter the Syrian government's narrative. This puts them at direct odds with what the government is saying, and essentially turns them into dissidents, even if they aren't necessarily, Syrian citizens or citizens of whatever country they're talking about. Now, typically, if you do that with a country like Syria, Twitter's not going to really care because, Assad and Jack, I guess, are not the best of buddies. But if you do that with a country like India, which is what OSINT News is accused of, ELINT News, well then you very well may get suspended by Twitter because the Indian government is very big and very powerful, and I'm sure there's a lot of Indian people who use Twitter, and if the Indian government started to crack down on Twitter, which the Indian government has already started to crack down on tech monopolies, as people like to call them, even though I don't think that's necessarily an accurate term, but India's been putting pressure on sites like Twitter, and so Twitter, I guess, is looking to oblige them in any way possible and offer up these small sacrifices of folks like Elant News, who are a thorn in the side of the Indian government because they tweet out facts even when that counters the Indian government's narrative. Now, this is obviously a huge escalation on Twitter's part. I didn't think that we'd get to this stage of the game this fast. I thought that they would focus on more piddly stuff like, culture war nonsense and just cracking down on people who don't use the correct, tranny pronouns or whatever nonsense that they're touting today. But Twitter's progressed very quickly to censoring real important facts that the public not only needs to know, but has every right to know. Twitter is partnering with tyrannical governments to a greater or lesser degree in trying to corral their citizens and manipulate the information that they're able to receive. Twitter is aiding and abetting these vile monsters in manipulating and controlling quite literally billions of people in the case of India and China. And as of right now, if anyone in the U.S. Congress wants to call out, Jack Dorsey and the Twitter folks for any sort of malpractice on their part and immoral behavior, they shouldn't worry about the censorship of, somebody like Alex Jones primarily, even though that is where this all started, is the banning of Alex Jones and other folks. And of course, before that, the shadow bans of various users and things. But if I were in Congress and I were questioning Jack, I would be questioning why he is giving aid and comfort to these governments in trying to crack down on their own people. Why is Jack complicit in tyranny? That would be my real question. Of course, I'm sure the U.S. government folks would not want to question Twitter about that because they would be very happy to employ the same sort of service from Twitter when they need it. Perhaps the U.S. would like Twitter to crack down on folks who perhaps question whether or not Iran was behind that recent oil tanker bombing. So all in all, Twitter is not a safe place anymore for the truth. They've come a long way from 2010, I think it was, when they were the epicenter of the Arab Spring, in which all the folks were using Facebook and Twitter to organize their marches, and Twitter was just sort of standing by and letting it happen. I guess because maybe those governments did not pay homage to Jack, and they did not kiss his ring and ask him nicely to delete all these accounts. But hey, here we are. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you back here in the next one.